Hello and how you doing, folks? Yours truly, Randy Rand here, and welcome to another edition of today's talk. Today we spoke to Shelley Henderson, who's the Inclusion and Diversity Manager for FIRST, which is an acronym which stands for for Inspiration and Recognition of Science and Technology. And the topic that we discussed today was how poverty has a detrimental effect on children as they strive to do well academically. This interview is a part of my poverty series, and speaking with different people about it. Of course, Shelley Henderson being one of them, and we talked about how people are struggling with different forms of poverty, as well as situational poverty, as well as people making bad decisions, which is why sometimes they may wind up in poverty. It was a great interview. Touched on many different reasons why people may find themselves in poverty, and we also discussed some strategies as to not to be or not to get in poverty as best as you can anyway, as well as coming out of poverty, what you can do to not stay there. It was a great interview and quite thought provoking. So you really want to listen to the interview, and I'd appreciate it if you listened to the interview. Thank you for the time. Yours truly, Randy Rand, for today's talk. And we're back. Yours truly, Randy Rand, here again for another version of today's talk. Welcome to the program. And we are speaking once again to Shelley Henderson, who's now a friend of the show. Shelley is the Diversity and Inclusion Manager for FIRST, which is for Inspiration and Recognition of Science and Technology. She has spent more than 20 years as a youth development specialist, certified teacher, a nonprofit executive, a university program coordinator, and an adjunct professor, as well as a community organizer, public policy advocate, and volunteer for a number of organizations and initiatives. How you doing, Shelley?
Hi, I'm doing great. It's been a busy week, but what a better way to end the week.
Very glad that you gave us some of your very valuable time today for this topic that we're discussing today, which is how poverty has a detrimental effect on children as they strive to do well academically. And the first question I want to ask, Shelley, um, in your opinion, what are some of the contributing factors to poverty?
Poverty is caused by, any number of things. And I think really it's your theory about what causes poverty that dictates how you respond to it. And so one of the things that we know, and probably one of the more readily accessible answered is that poverty sometimes is caused by these life shocks. So things that happen in life, sometimes they're traumatic, and sometimes they have financial implications. And so these are the things that causes people who would not cause themselves to be in, or would not see themselves as being in poverty, to people who find themselves certainly in poverty. And so some of these life shocks include things like, marital breakups, an unexpected and substantial drop in somebody's income, or some other kind of financial loss, major damages to your home, natural disasters, fires, that kind of thing, incarceration, illness. If something happens to your body and you're not able to function like you normally do, those things cause that financial instability that places people in poverty, and sometimes unexpectedly so. And there are other causes. I mean, sometimes we think of poverty as having to do with an individual's deficiency. So some theories kind of focus on the individual as being responsible for their own situation. Like if you were smarter, if you worked harder, if you had the right incentives, you could improve your own condition. And I think some of those individualistic views of poverty and how it's caused really limit us with ways that we can solve some of these issues. And I think broader broader causes or theories, systems and structures actually have more to do with it than folks tend to realize.
Okay, now the next question I want to ask is kind of piggybacking off of what you have said as well as the question that I just asked. But if you could please speak about how easy it is to find yourself in poverty, or if you're not careful.
So if you're not careful, you can easily find yourself in poverty. As you mentioned before, I used to be a school teacher. I used to teach middle school young people, and it was at a suburban magnet school. So the base of the children attending the school were more well-to-do. They lived in a more affluent neighborhood. And the young people that were bused in from Northeast and Southeast Omaha were primarily Black and Hispanic. And we were doing a project where they had to design or develop a utopian society. So everything being equal, everybody has what they need to thrive. You are creating your own perfect society. And one of my students said, well, in my utopia, there would not be homeless people. And, being the teacher that I am, rather than, chastising her for her thoughts or being harsh with her, I just explained to her that whether you consider yourself to be in poverty or you consider yourself to have access to great means, a lot of people really are living check to Monday. So It
Yes.
doesn't matter what you have, what you've accumulated over time, what your income is, and what your pay stub says. A lot of people are living above their means. And I think with some of the economic downturn and a little bit of the recession, a lot of people used credit cards and a few other resources. Payday lending spiked. A lot of people were using resources that they didn't really have access to. And so anything could happen to make your situation financially to become very unstable, especially because a lot of us are living check to Monday.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether it's that student who's, from a two-parent home, she feels very comfortable. She has no idea what her parents do to make ends meet, or the children that were bused to us, from these other and fragile kinds of situations. What I had to tell her is that she is equally situated to find herself in poverty as some of those other students who she associates with poverty.
Now, you mentioned children, and especially the latter example that you just used. Say the little girl who has no idea that her parents are going through all of these changes. They're working incredibly hard to provide for her the very basic necessities, never mind the luxuries that she may be having. But on the other hand, there are children that are lacking, whether they're impoverished or if they're from a single family home or they're just, not making a lot of money. I want you to please speak about how children can be left behind in today's technological and academic environment if they can't afford the technology, say like the internet, Wi-Fi, broadband, that's necessary to compete and learn.
So, being a former school teacher in that magnet school, I realized that the digital divide is real.
Yes.
And so gone were the days of me just, assigning homework, assuming that every student had the tools that they needed to complete those assignments. And so one of the things that I've heard people say kind of in retort to the need to pay attention to this digital divide is that some of these same students come to school with smartphones. And so if they can afford a smartphone, or if their parents can afford for them to have a smartphone, they have access to the technology that they need, or they can get it. And I guess what I would say to that is just that it's not so. I wouldn't say most, many young people still don't have access to, a dedicated internet connection at home. We know that this digital divide has far-reaching consequences for them when it comes to completing what they need to complete. For children in low-income school districts, sometimes it's the schools that have inadequate access to technology that
Mm-hmm.
actually hinders them from learning some
Yes.
of the tech skill sets that are crucial in today's economy. So it's not necessarily just what kids have at home or not. I am seeing a lot of schools and school districts that don't have what they need.
That is so true. That is so true. We are speaking with Shelley Henderson. She's the Diversity and Inclusion Manager for FIRST, which is an acronym which stands for Inspiration and Recognition of Science and Technology. She has spent more than 20 years working as a youth development specialist, certified teacher, a nonprofit executive, a university program coordinator, as well as an adjunct professor, community organizer, a public policy advocate, and volunteer for a number of organizations and initiatives. And we're so appreciative that she gave us some of her very valuable time today. Shelley, what's your opinion about the development of a program, or say programs, that address the need of children who can't afford the computers or the Wi-Fi or broadband or internet?
That's a great question. So, before I ask that question, I just want to share something related, and then I'll get to that question.
Sure.
I think in the wake of um, our new president-elect Donald Trump,
Mm-hmm.
we need to be very critical of, and we need to pay very close attention to some of what he's proposed to ensure that public education in general gets delivered differently. And so we've been working really hard. And when I say we, I mean the collective we, policymakers, people on the ground in schools and running programs like the one that I am working so hard with, improving diversity and inclusion. Some of the pieces of the Every Student Succeeds Act that deal with career and technical education and providing young people with access to these technologies and leveling the playing field. You know, had we had this interview prior to the election, my answer probably would have been very different to what it is today.
Hmm. That's why I want,
So,
and not to interrupt, but that's exactly why I wanted to do this interview after the election because
mhm.
when you have a person that's elected, no matter whom it is, they have a certain purview, they have an idea of how they want to move forward with regards to certain issues, say like in education. And I knew that if Trump would have won, well, things might have been thrown up in the air with regards to how education is funded.
Yeah, I so agree. So a lot of the things, fortunately, a lot of the things that were put into the Every Student Succeeds Act, kind of give states a great deal of flexibility in how they pull together their accountability plans and how they implement some of these equity issues. So even, for example, if the Office of Civil Rights that is within the Department of Education is eliminated, and that is probably likely, some of the initiatives could still go forward, but it really puts the onus upon state departments of education and local school districts to prioritize equity. They're not going to be forced to do a lot of this. They have to prioritize it. So, to your question had to do with making sure that, how important it is to making sure that programs have access to, or that programs are implementing within their curriculum and within their game design. So one of the things that I would say is, young people are in school, about 7 to 8 hours per day, but they are in their own neighborhoods and their own communities and in after school programs a good balance of the time that they're not in schools. And so I think it really is up to after school programs and communities to pick up this mantle and make sure that what's required for the careers that exist today and even careers that don't yet exist and what's being offered in some of these places that are a little more nimble than schools can be are in some way aligned, and that these corporations who are waiting for young people to kind of matriculate up the talent pipeline and up that ladder to them, that they do a little more than just wait. That these corporations have employee engagement programs where their employees can be out in communities working and mentoring and supporting. But our after-school programs in our communities need to realize that getting young people ready for a technology-rich society and, career and technical education and just getting them ready requires us to make those connections and make that alignment happen. And so we can send our young people to places where, enrichment is going on, and like my son, who's 10, he goes to an after-school program, and I want him to do a little more than bounce a basketball.
Sure.
I want him to be exposed to some of this information, to some coding, to some technologies, so that he is having an opportunity to tinker at his age. Absolutely. And really expand his own vision of who he can become.
Now, the second part of that question is, do you believe such programs could work on a long-term basis? And the reason I ask that question is because, everybody, well, not everybody, but there are many people that start, a program that would add to the enrichment of any child academically. But a lot of times these programs, they're too short and they fizzle out, and, it's just like nobody did anything at all to improve the situation. Things like this, or programs like this, need to be done with a long-term view. Do you think that could happen on a long-term basis? Why or why not?
So I think we have to have a couple of approaches. I think we have to have kind of that grassroots, day-to-day, short-term. We have to have those pieces in mind. So on the ground, kids have access to these programs and projects, new tools and technologies. But I think the other thing that I was alluding to earlier has got to be as important. So there are other causes to poverty. For example, poverty is also created by the transmission of generations and generations of a set of beliefs and values that are socially generated but individually held. Okay. And sometimes it's not the individuals are necessarily to blame for some of the dysfunction that they're seeing. And, poverty is caused by economic, political, and social distortions, and sometimes even discrimination. Yes. And so sometimes we can't just look to individuals as either the source of their poverty or the source of the solution. We have to look at some of these economic, political, and social systems which cause people to have limited opportunities and resources. That means sometimes it's not just a single mentor, teacher, program, experience. There has to be kind of a broader grassroots and grass tops approach to looking at individuals and their communities as really sometimes being caught in a spiral of opportunity and problems, and making sure that we kind of address that, these policies too, so that instead of looking at individual situations and communities as resources and that these things are mutually independent, we need to look at them as if they are mutually dependent in conjunction with what we know is kind of a faltering economic system here, and create individuals who can participate in the broader economy and so that they can participate in that economy and make things better as a whole. So I think we have to do, again, kind of that grassroots work really hard, put together these programs, but also change policies and structures and systems and institutions.
Now, you mentioned policy, and I'm glad you did because you're taking me right into my next question, and that is, what types of policy would you like to see established in order to successfully fight against poverty?
So one of the things that I want to say before I answer that question is that over the years, we actually have had lots of policies in place. I mean, if you think all the way back to President Lyndon Johnson and the poverty bill and the war on poverty and all of these programs that got rolled out as a result of that. The belief was that if you expand the federal government's role in education on things like health care and child care and welfare, that you would be fixing people. And if we fix people, then we will have solved this problem. And as I said to you earlier, that's just not so. So the, array of programs that were created from Head Start to, welfare and WIC and so many of these other programs were really aimed at making sure that people who were struggling were fixed. So we're fixing broken people and not broken systems. And so I think we need to look back at our history of just creating more policies and programs and be a little more intentional. And so to get to your question, I think that we need to look at a few things. I think we need to really take a look at affordable and high quality childcare for low income families so that parents can actually work and children can thrive. And we've had legislation like this before, but one of the things that I know too is that some of the people who work in these child care spaces, for all intents and purposes, these workers, these practitioners are signing up for poverty. So they're not making what they need to make. And so the quality of these child care spaces is fragile in and of itself because we're putting, on the back of people who are struggling as workers. They're not making very much. The great responsibility of shaping young people in their most formative years. And we just need to do better. So that kind of affordable, high quality child care needs to be more than what it's been. It needs to focus on enabling the workforce to create the quality, bias-free, inclusive environments for young people, but it also needs to not create a problem for families who are trying to work. I have 5 children myself, and one of the things that was important to me was keeping them in spaces that I could trust. And so my mother had a huge role in caring for my children while I was working and also going to school. And it's because I wasn't sure. I just wasn't certain that I could get the quality of care in a daycare setting that I could get for my children being with my mother. So I think we just need to shore up this notion of child care. Had I had to pay for child care for all of my 5 children, it would have cost more than it would cost to send them to college.
Wow.
I'm sure of that.
Wow.
I'm sure of that. So in addition to, and I won't go into as much detail, but in addition to affordable and high quality child care, I think really, really looking at a substantial jobs and workforce agenda is going to be important. And it's not just about making sure that opportunities are there for low income workers to earn a living wage. I think we also have to think about entrepreneurship and some of those other pieces of a substantial and all more comprehensive jobs agenda will prepare people not just to take a job, but to make jobs. And so I think we need to look at that. Access to post-secondary education is something that's been a part of this presidential campaign season and debate, but also just making sure that our safety net pieces are there to fill gaps that build on, some of the successes of the earned income tax credits and some of these other programs. Like we need to make robust improvements around some of these. And the last thing I'll say on the on the policy piece around poverty
Mm-hmm.
is that we have got to be very careful about how some of these anti-poverty policies marginalize Black fathers. And so, some of the policies that I've mentioned before, whether it's, welfare, WIC, Head Start, some of these things, the systems were pulled together and designed in such a way that the role of a Black father in particular was unnecessary because they counted them off as non-contributors, as deadbeats. And so I think that no matter what we do on the policy front, we need to really, really address that.
We have been speaking with Shelley Henderson. She's the Diversity and Inclusion Manager for FIRST, which is an acronym which stands for Inspiration and Recognition of Science and Technology. She has spent more than 20 years working as a youth development specialist, a certified teacher, nonprofit executive, university program coordinator, as well as an adjunct professor, a community organizer, a public policy advocate, and volunteer for a number of organizations and initiatives. Today, we were speaking about how poverty has a detrimental effect on children as they strive to do well academically. And Shelley, again, I thank you so very much for giving us some of your very valuable time. And in closing, please feel free to plug your website or any other projects that you are involved in.
One of the things that we have not really touched on in this conversation is, how poverty can stand to affect young people in the classroom. And so one of the things that I'm glad that we're looking at in the Midwest, and I know that other communities are looking at, is just the impact of trauma on young people. And so there's a lot of literature that would really focus on the impact of trauma within the context of urban poverty, and really looking at how trauma-informed care can and should focus on some of our responses to what really are toxic situations for some young people, and that trauma-specific interventions can really strengthen young people, the families' ability to adapt and cope and heal from these traumas, but also to help educators understand why certain things are playing out in their classrooms. I think sometimes teachers have their own biases and they make assumptions about what they're seeing when sometimes they see children misbehaving. And so I think that approach to really understanding trauma and what's actually playing out in classrooms and in daycares is important. Sure. So first and foremost, I as you mentioned before, I work for FIRST, which is an acronym for Inspiration and Recognition of Science and Technology. We run 4 programs, a progression of programs that meet the needs of young people from kindergarten all the way through the 12th grade. And as a part of the diversity and inclusion work that I do, really understanding what young people who are experiencing poverty need is a priority. And so I'm glad about that, and I'm excited about what we are hoping to do. The website is www.firstinspires.org. You can find us on Twitter as well, at First Tweets. And I'm just really excited about the work that I've been able to and empowered to do with some tools and resources to do it.